Welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility, an ongoing inquiry into American political origins and evolving institutions. The Executive Director of the Virtual Center is Dr. Bill O'Brien. He's also your host for this conversation. Here he is now, Dr. Bill O'Brien.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome to the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. It's been so long since I've said that I wanted to say it all, and I did. Welcome to today's program. It is a Tuesday. It is the 17th day of June, and I'm guessing that where you are, it's probably pretty warm, although I realize with the Internet, it's possible that you might be in places where it's not. And I understand that. But here in the East, today so far is clearly the hottest day in the year. But the promises are that tomorrow will be even warmer. So if we set a record today, it won't last that long. It is a pleasure to be with you here at the Virtual Center. We're going to open with a couple of announcements. And basically, it's been so long since I've been with you that I thought we might do a little bit of this and a little bit of that here for a while to kind of get a little bit reoriented and then get into something perhaps a little bit more substantive than that. Let me begin by giving you our phone number. It's a new number, so I want to try to remember to say it or repeat it as often as I can. The number is area code 304-574-8178. That's 304-574-8178. My email address, if you'd like to communicate with me directly on issues related to the Constitution or related to our program or whatever, I would love to hear from you. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien906, all one word, at gmail.com. I got back in the car and drove another 1,500 miles over the last week. I found out that I had an opportunity to get together with a brother and sister that I haven't seen together for quite a while, since last fall, and the opportunity was presenting itself, so I made kind of a snap decision last weekend that I really had better avail myself of the opportunity to get up there while I had the chance. So I left a week ago Saturday, drove into Massachusetts, got there Saturday evening, spent 4 or 5 days with my brother and sister, and then drove back here to southern West Virginia just prior to this most recent weekend. We had an issue yesterday which kind of made it difficult to do a program. There was some question that Bob Kincaid, the producer of this program, might not be available. So we had decided that we wouldn't do a program yesterday, but on the other hand, we made a decision that if it was possible to do one today, we would, and here we are. So again, it is a pleasure to be with you here on a Tuesday afternoon. Again, our phone number, area code 304-574-8178. I do have kind of an important announcement that I want to open the program with today, and it's going to be a regular change in our time for live broadcasts at the Virtual Center. As you know, in the East, we have been operating, for the most part, in a 4 to 6 p.m. slot on Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. Beginning tomorrow, we're going to move that start time back from 4 p.m. to 1 p.m. So beginning tomorrow, we'll be doing our Virtual Center programs from 1 p.m. to 3 p.m. And there's been some schedule changing at the Head-On Radio Network, and it seemed like, Bob and I talked a little bit last evening, it seemed like this would be a mutually positive change in time, both for other folks here at the head-on radio network, but for me also. I'm very flexible, and to be very honest with you, I kind of build my day around these programs, especially on broadcast days, which are the first 3 days of the week, Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. So, I'm more than happy with a little bit of notice, and we do have that. So beginning tomorrow, and then next week we'll be doing it each day, beginning at 1 p.m. in the East. And I know a number of you listen to the program in an archived format because your time doesn't jive with our time here in the Eastern time zone, Eastern Daylight Savings time zone. I understand that. But for those of you who do tune in, and those are the ones of you that we look to get calls from, we will be beginning our broadcast starting tomorrow at 1 p.m. And at least into the foreseeable future, we'll be doing that. There could be additional changes later on, but we'll have to see. We'll have to see how this goes. I mentioned the last time we were together that I am going back over previous programs and listening to the full program again, with the idea that I'm trying to write up a summary of the program as I listen to it, so that our website, which we will be developing in the near future, our website will contain not only archived programs, which are available now at whiterosesociety.org, but they will have more information on them than merely the date of delivery. They will have a summary associated with each program, which will give folks interested in particular programs an opportunity to see what the program is about, so that they can target specific issues and specific programs that are of most interest to them. I mentioned that I wanted to kind of get into a little bit of this, that, and the other thing here for a while, because I've been receiving emails, a number of emails, from different people on different topics, and each one of them seems, I look at it and I say, oh boy, we could do a program on this, and then I look at another one, I say we could do a program on that. One of the things that I received in recent days was an email which kind of covered a survey that was done by the Pew Trust, on polarization in American politics. And the general conclusion is, and I don't think this surprises anybody, that America probably is more polarized now, or seems to be more polarized now, than it's ever been before. At least people believe that to be true. That's what the survey revealed. And when I received the email, my first reaction was, well, this creates a kind of emergency in a way, because it suggests that the two-party system created by the founders, built on the objective of negotiation and compromise, seems to be in greater and greater danger all the time of falling through the cracks. So in a sense, it seems to me we really need to readdress some of these issues. And I thought that one of the programs we might do in the very near future would be a program in which we revisit the founders, revisit Madison a little bit, from Federalist number 10 and Federalist number 39 specifically, on the idea of how the Republic, as the Constitution refashioned it, would promote compromise and negotiation by driving political extremes toward the center in a majority rule political situation. And of course, all of us have been overwhelmed the last 3 or 4 days with results from last Tuesday's primary elections, specifically the defeat in Virginia of Eric Cantor. Nobody anticipated this defeat. The polls showed him to be way ahead. He outspent his unknown political opponent by an incredible amount. And very honestly, the pollsters were blindsided by the result of this. And we've seen a lot of positions and arguments and prospective insights into what might have gone wrong with Eric Cantor. He was too establishment. He wasn't conservative enough. He somehow was able to irk and get on the wrong side of the Tea Party. But whatever. He lost, and it's created a shakeup within the ranks of the Republican Party, especially in the House of Representatives. And so now the issue is, and the debate is, whether in fact this is a defeat for the Republican Party or a benefit. Is this a benefit for the Tea Party? And if it is a benefit for the Tea Party, does this mean it's a benefit for the Republican Party, or it's a setback at past? Anyway, that's a program that I think we really do want to revisit James Madison. One of the things that I discovered just last evening, and I haven't mentioned this here at the Virtual Center for a long time, if I mentioned it at all, was a program of primary sources called Rotunda. I don't know if many of you listening have heard me talk about the Rotunda database collection before. But Rotunda is a collection of primary source materials initiated principally at the University of Virginia and made available through the University Press. The history grant, the PRISM West Virginia history grant that we had been working on since 2009, one of the benefits of that program was that we were able to use grant dollars to make the Rotunda program available, more readily available to people in this region, specifically Appalachia. What we wanted to do was give our teachers in the PRISM program direct access to the most comprehensive, richest collection of primary source materials on the founding that has ever existed. And we were able to do that, and we were able to make it available on the Concord University website. And the only requirement for access to Rotunda was that an individual had to be registered in the Concord University email system. In other words, you theoretically had to be a student or a graduate or an employee of Concord University. And of course, the reality is that as students graduate, they continue to retain their Concord email address. All of our teachers in the prison program, even though the program is pretty much over, all of our teachers have Concord University email addresses. And the idea was that for the rest of their professional lives, our teachers would have access, direct access, to the Rotunda program. And again, we were able to use grant money to pay the license fee to the University of Virginia so that these resources, this database, would be available to subscribers forever. Well, it has been a couple of years, not quite a couple of years, but well over a year, since I've had occasion to go into the Rotunda program. Much of the material that I've been dealing with here at the Virtual Center so far is in print, is in book form of one kind or another. But this weekend, I kind of got it in my head that I really wanted to access Rotunda. No, not for a specific reason, but I wanted to basically make sure that the site was still there. And lo and behold, last night in plowing around, I found out that indeed it is. So I spent an hour and a half last evening, and 2 or 3 hours this morning, revisiting the 18th century with some of these primary sources. These sources are incredible. Not only does the Rotunda site contain all the letters sent and received by most of the prominent founders, George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, Patrick Henry, but it also contains all of the research done by the Federal Ratification Project at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. Under a previous history grant, which I had written for Concord in 2002, we were able to buy the hardbound volumes, which at that time were about 14 or 15 volumes of the Ratification Project. And what the Ratification Project did was go through and collect all of the primary source materials related to ratification in every one of the 13 states. And this material is being published as part of the Ratification Project, volume by volume, state by state. It's been going on for better than 30 years, and it is still going on. And I'm guessing, I was led to believe that the state that the project was working on right now was Maryland, and that gave me particular interest because Maryland's the state that I researched for my dissertation. Well, in checking Rotunda, Maryland's not there yet. Now, whether that means it just hasn't been posted yet, or whether the volume has not been completed by the project people yet, I'm not sure. But I began to do some plowing around in the Rotunda site last night. I mean, it contains the letters, it contains speeches, it contains the debates of the Continental Congress, of the Constitutional Convention, of the First Congress of the United States, all the records associated with the passage of the Bill of Rights. All of it is in this collection. It is a gold mine for people interested in the 18th century. Also available at the same website is the Evans manuscript collection, and the Evans collection includes everything ever printed in the United States up through the 18th century, up through the 19th century. Pamphlets, documents, magazines, broadsides, handbills, on and on and on. I keep thinking, if, you know, when I did my research for my dissertation, if this site had been available, of course the fact of the matter is, it's people, and I don't take any claim for this personally, but it's people that I went to seminar with who are principally responsible for the pulling together of the materials that made the success of this project possible. Anyway, with that rather lengthy introduction, I thought I would share with you a letter which was written on the 30th of March, 1788, which is about 3 weeks before Maryland's ratifying convention meets at Annapolis. And it's a letter from Luther Martin, who was one of Maryland's delegates to the Constitutional Convention. And it's addressed to the citizens of the United States, and it's postmarked Baltimore, March 30th, 1788. We've talked a lot about ratification. We've talked a lot about the Federalists and the Anti-Federalists. We've talked a lot about the Federalist Papers. We've talked about the political overtones of this debate and the political strategies employed by both the Federalists to get the Constitution ratified and the Anti-Federalists to try to prevent that ratification. Luther Martin did not spend all of that much time at the Constitutional Convention, in large part because he opposed it. He showed up late and he left early. And he left early because he could not support what he was seeing at the Constitutional Convention. I thought that the folks here at the Virtual Center, that you folks, might enjoy hearing Luther Martin's letter to the people of the United States in response to those who were attacking him and trying to attack his reputation in order to deny him the national audience that he sought as he tried to alert the nation to the dangers of the new Constitution. Again, one of the things we've learned here at the Virtual Center, I hope, is that you can talk, you can lecture, you can paraphrase from now till doomsday about sources and letters and documents and all the rest of it. But there's absolutely nothing to beat the resource itself. So I thought you might appreciate the flavor and the tone of Luther Martin's challenge to the Constitutional Convention. He says, this is not the entire report. This is only a portion of it, but it's the key portion, I think. As far as I have expressed my opinions of the views of the framers of the Constitution, I have followed the fullest conviction of my mind, founded on my own observations made on their conduct while in convention, and confirmed by the conduct of the friends of the system since that time. To paraphrase for a moment, what he's basically doing is responding to those who have criticized him as being a naysayer and being against everything and exaggerating about the dangers of the Constitution. What Luther Martin is affirming here is that everything I have done and everything I have said is totally, fully consistent with what he calls the fullest conviction of my mind, founded on what I've seen, on my own observations, on the conduct of those who were in convention, and these observations have been confirmed by the conduct of friends of the new Constitution since that time. They were my sentiments while I was there. I at that time expressed them freely, and then found many who perfectly corresponded with me in sentiment, although some of them may not now choose to avow it, no doubt from a conviction of their error, or no doubt from a conviction of their error, may now advocate the system they there condemned and opposed. In other words, I expressed myself openly at the time, and there were a lot of people who agreed with me then who are taking issue with me now. And they won't acknowledge that originally they agreed with me. Maybe they changed their mind. Maybe they become supporters of a system that they originally condemned. But the fact of the matter is, there are a lot of people who are taking issue with what I've reported and what I've said that originally agreed with me. But as to myself, Luther Martin says, so far from having any reason to change the opinion I there formed, every circumstance which has since taken place has confirmed it. In other words, what I thought then, I'm even more sure of now. So he's laying the context for his next paragraph, which I think is a pretty powerful attack on the Constitutional Convention held in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787. This is what Luther Martin says. The conduct adopted by the convention rendered the dissemination of these sheets. These are sheets. What he means is pages of testimony that he delivered before the Maryland legislature. When he returned from Philadelphia, he was asked to come in and give a report to the Maryland General House of Delegates on what he had seen there. And when he talks about the dissemination of these sheets, he's talking about the report that he delivered to the Maryland House of Delegates. The conduct adopted by the convention rendered the dissemination of these sheets the more necessary. In other words, what I saw in the convention made me more convinced than ever that I had to get out the word as to what was going on. Could there possibly be a greater indignity and insult offered to the majesty of the free states and the free citizens of America than for the very men who were entrusted with powers for the preservation and security of their rights and for the establishment of a permanent system to promote their happiness, to make use of that power to destroy both the one and the other? In other words, could there be anything worse than people who are elected to represent the people and make the kinds of changes necessary to protect their rights and to help set up a permanent system in order to promote the happiness of citizens? Could there be anything worse than these people turning around and using that power to destroy both of them, the rights of citizens and a permanent system to promote the happiness of citizens? For this purpose, he says, in time of profound peace, to shut themselves up in mystery and darkness, to keep all their deliberations an absolute secret from their constituents, who were to be affected thereby, to prevent the publication of their journals, to deprive the free citizens of America of every means of information, to attempt to pass upon them, as meeting with their unanimous approbation, that which did not in reality meet with the perfect approbation of perhaps one individual in the convention, to give you no other alternative but to accept of it as proposed, without alteration, or to reject it entirely, while at the same time some of them were resounding from one end of the continent to the other, the necessity of its acceptance, and that none but the enemies of their country would reject it. That's one of the most powerful statements about the Constitutional Convention that I've ever read. Think about what he says. In time of profound peace, these people shut themselves up in mystery and darkness. In other words, they voted to hold all their debates and discussions in secret, to keep all their deliberations an absolute secret from their constituents who were to be affected thereby, to prevent the publication of their journals, to deprive the free citizens of America of every means of information, to attempt to pass upon them as meeting with their unanimous approbation that which did not in reality meet with the perfect approbation of perhaps one individual in the convention. In other words, for this convention, for the delegates in this convention, to come out unanimously in total support of the Constitution, when in fact the Constitution as written in the convention didn't satisfy one member completely. To give you, the citizens, no other alternative but to accept it as proposed, without alteration, or to reject it. In other words, you couldn't amend it, you couldn't change it, you had to vote either up or down. And then basically to frame that by suggesting that anyone who opposed it was an enemy to their country, and those enemies were the only ones who would reject it. And then finally, he says, to abuse your confidence in them by endeavoring to hurry you into a hasty adoption under that delusion before you could obtain information and be able to form a proper judgment for yourselves. They did all of this. And then they basically said, we have to run this through quickly. We don't have time to debate. We got to move this along. And so citizens are neither given information nor given the time to gather that information. I think that this document by Luther Martin is a concise, very powerful statement of the position that the Anti-Federalists were taking on the Constitutional Convention and on the work of the framers. We focused most of our attention up to this point on Madison and Hamilton and the Federalist Papers and the way that the Federalists were able to spin the Constitution and to meet challenges against it and counter those challenges with very positive and persuasive arguments designed to reassure citizens who were at best skeptical and at worst outright afraid. But here's somebody who was there, who goes back to his legislature, reports back to the Maryland House of Delegates, and says basically, here's what they were doing up there, this is why I left. I think what this document does for me is lay out very clearly the context for the struggle over ratification. Luther Martin is suggesting what the Federalists were trying to do and how they were trying to do it. What they were doing and what they were not doing. What they were saying and what they were not saying. But it's very obvious from what we've already done here in programs previously that the Federalists had a tremendous advantage. For one thing, they had the advantage of being positive. It's very difficult to constantly be arguing in the negative, to be someone who's opposed to everything. There's a distinct advantage to one, for a person whose job is to argue positively why something is good. So they had the advantage. They had the advantage of time. They had the advantage of lack of information on the other side. They had the advantage of the inability of the Anti-Federalists to organize the opposition. What we see as ratification goes on, state after state after state, is that the Anti-Federalist opposition is becoming more focused and more organized as the process goes on. But the Federalists are pushing hard and pushing fast. They want this Constitution ratified before the opponents of it have an opportunity to organize and to devise a strategy to counter it. And of course, the strategy that ultimately emerges is the absence of a Bill of Rights and the possibility, A, that states would conditionally ratify by saying we will ratify the Constitution provided these amendments are added. And when the Federalists are confronted with that, they have no option but to say, if you ratify now, we promise we will provide a Bill of Rights later. That's Madison's position when he switches from an opponent of amendments to a supporter of amendments in the House of Representatives. Madison feels like we got the Constitution through because we made a commitment to citizens that amendments would be approved. We have got to follow through with that promise, is Madison's position in the first Congress. So again, I think Luther Martin's letter really kind of sets a tone. This is the kind of stuff you can find on the Rotunda site. It's just fabulous. Letters by Washington, Jefferson. Not only that, but there's one section where, by date, all the letters related sent back and forth by different people during this period related to the Constitution are printed there in these volumes. But then another chapter, and the bulk of the state-by-state story of ratification. And you may recall that Pauline Maier, before her unfortunate passing in I believe it was 2012, was able to publish her book on ratification, which she acknowledged she owed principally to the ratification project. And she acknowledged that the chapters of my book which deal with the states that have already been completed in the project are the strongest chapters. The other chapters in my book, the ones pertaining to states that the project has not yet gotten to, are chapters which are much weaker and much less definitive. But Pauline Maier's study of the Constitution, it's a huge volume, came out, I believe, in 2010, 2011. It's a fantastic study, and it's based on the resources and the source materials compiled by this project, being headed up now by John Kaminsky and Rich Leffler and Gaspar Saladino and some of the other folks in Madison. So, again, I think it's very, very, very pertinent, I think. Let me shift gears again, because the last program that we did here at the Virtual Center, we were looking at the Bill of Rights, and we looked at a couple of amendments in detail. The First Amendment, principally, and the Second Amendment on the right to bear arms. And we spent quite a bit of time on that. We looked at the original version. We looked at the version that Madison and his committee sent up to the United States Senate, and then we looked at the Second Amendment as it came back from the Senate. And it, of course, is the Second Amendment as it reads right now in our Constitution. And the debate that rages about whether the right to bear arms is a natural right. And we talked a little bit in our last program about efforts of groups like the NRA to promote the idea that the right to bear arms is a natural right. The founders intended it to be such. And then in 2008, when the Heller decision came up before the Supreme Court, a decision on the constitutionality of Washington, D.C.'s gun law, a majority of the Supreme Court, 5-4 majority, found in favor of the NRA's interpretation about the right to bear arms. And that's been the debate ever since then, with the NRA and the right to ban assault weapons and all the other things. One of the documents that I came across in my reading is a document written, I don't know who wrote this, but the title is "A Citizen of the State of Maryland Remarks on a Standing Army." So here is a document published in the newspapers by a citizen of the state of Maryland on remarks related to a standing army. I thought, given the debate and given the interest in the Second Amendment today, this full document you might find interesting. It's just 20 minutes before the hour, so we've got 20 minutes left in this, our first hour. I think we've got plenty of time, and then we'll get into an issue that I really wanted to begin today and perhaps pursue tomorrow. But anyway, this is what the citizen of the state of Maryland says about the idea of a standing army. The following remarks on a standing army were written by a citizen of the state of Maryland, and we judge them well worthy the attention of the Friends to Liberty at this critical juncture. This, as an introduction, appears in the Maryland newspaper. And here are the remarks from a citizen on the state of Maryland on the idea of a standing army. In England, by their Bill of Rights, a standing army is declared to be contrary to their constitution, and a militia the only natural and safe defense of a free people. This keeps the jealousy of the nation constantly awake and has proved the foundation of all the other checks. So what he is saying is, in England, the English Bill of Rights declares that a standing army is in violation of the English Constitution, and that the only natural safe defense of a free people is in its militia. This, says the citizen of Maryland, keeps the jealousy of the nation constantly awake and has proved the foundation for all other checks. Then he says, that's in England. And then he says, in the American Constitution as now proposed, there is no such declaration or check at all. In England, the military are declared by their constitution to be in all cases subordinate to the civil power. And consequently, the civil officers have always been active in supporting this preeminence. In other words, throughout English history, as declared by the Constitution, military power must always be subordinate to civil power. And civil officers have always supported this particular, what he calls preeminence, this fact. In the American Constitution, there's no such declaration. Now, remember, all of this speaks to the need for a Bill of Rights. That's what this is. That's the context here. In the American Constitution, as written by the Convention before a Bill of Rights is added, there's no such declaration. In England, the Mutiny Bill can only be passed from year to year or on its expiration. On its expiration, every soldier is free and the equal by law of the first general officer of the land. In England, the statement of what is called a mutiny bill is passed on a year-to-year basis. It's renewed every year. And it basically declares that every soldier is free. In America, the Articles of War, which is the same thing, have been already considered perpetual, as I am well informed, under even the present Congress. Although the constitutions of all the states positively forbid any standing troops at all, much less laws for them. In England, the dangers of a standing army are repeated and revisited every year. But in America, the Articles of War make this issue considered to be perpetual, even though the constitutions of the states positively forbid standing troops at all, much less laws for them. In England, the appropriation of money for the support of their army must be from year to year. In America, it may be for double that period. By keeping the military, by keeping the army dependent on annual appropriations of money in England, the civil authority is able to keep control of the military. But in America, there's no year-to-year thing required at all. It's double that period. So he's basically, what he's done is he's laid out 3 or 4 contrasts between the British Constitution and the American Constitution related to the issue of standing army. And then he says, how favorable is this contrast to Britain? That Britain which we lavished our blood and treasure to separate ourselves from, as a country of slavery. But we then held different sentiments from those now become so fashionable. For this I appeal to the constitutions of the several states. And what, of course, he's pointing out, he's summarizing here by saying it's really kind of ironic that we had to fight for our independence from a nation, England, that actually is much more in tune with what we believe about the standing army than the Constitution we're currently proposing, which is the one drafted at the Philadelphia Convention. Now he goes into the different states, and I think this is really significant. I think all of us would be interested in this information. In the Declaration of Rights for Massachusetts, Section 17, the people have a right to keep and bear arms for the common defense. And as in time of peace, armies are dangerous to liberty. They ought not to be maintained without the consent of the legislature, and the military power shall always be held in exact subordination to the civil authority and be governed by it. The reason that people need to be able to have arms, the right to bear arms, is because they have a responsibility to serve in the militia if needed, since the militia is the only protection from an autocratic government that would use a standing army to take away people's liberties. The whole purpose of the right to bear arms is service in the militia. That's Section 17 of the Massachusetts Declaration of Rights. In Section 27 of that same document, in time of peace, no soldier ought to be quartered in any house without the consent of the owner. And in time of war, such quarters ought not to be made but by the civil magistrate in a manner ordained by the legislature. So that's what the Massachusetts Constitution has in terms of the right to bear arms, the consideration of the standing army, the idea of the militia, etc. Now, the citizen of Maryland addresses the Constitution of Pennsylvania. Declaration of Rights of Pennsylvania, Section 13, that the people have a right to bear arms for the defense of themselves and the state. And as standing armies in the time of peace are dangerous, and as standing armies in time of peace are dangerous to liberty, they ought not to be kept up, and that the military should be kept under strict subordination to and governed by the civil power. So again, the issue here is a national standing army versus a state-controlled militia. In neither case does the right of the citizen to bear arms trump either of those power sources. It's either the federal government with a standing army or it's the state government with a militia. But it is not the independent right of each citizen to take up arms against its own government. And I think that's significant. Next, Declaration of Rights in Maryland, Section 25, that a well-regulated militia is the proper and natural defense of a free government. Section 26, that standing armies are dangerous to liberty and ought not to be raised or kept without consent of the legislature. Section 27, that in all cases and at all times, the military ought to be under strict subordination to and control of the civil power. And finally, Section 28, that no soldier ought to be quartered in any house in time of peace without the consent of the owner, and in time of war, in such manner only as the legislature shall direct. Again, the context of the right to bear arms is service in the militia as the only legitimate defense against the dangers of a standing army. What makes this particularly significant today, of course, is that, in effect, we do have a standing army. We have an all-volunteer army. When our army was staffed principally by draftees during military crisis, the citizens of the nation had skin in the game. They had a direct reason to maintain civilian control over the military because their own family members were in it. Now with the volunteer army, I would suggest to you that the citizens at large have lost control over the military. And now that control seems to depend on the interactions of the President and the Congress. Declaration of Rights of Delaware, exact same words as Maryland. Declaration of Rights of North Carolina, Section 17, that the people have a right to bear arms for the defense of the state, and as standing armies in times of peace are dangerous to liberty, they ought not to be kept up, and that the military should be kept under strict subordination and governed by the civil power. That's North Carolina. Constitution of South Carolina, Section 42, that the military be subordinate to the civil power of the state. But some writers have told us that our poverty is best security against many standing troops. Are we then and our posterity always to be poor? This is the citizen of Maryland again speaking, saying that some writers have told us that because we are poor, this is our best security against a standing army, because there won't be money to pay them. Are we then and our prosperity always to be poor? This security would certainly cease without poverty. But the truth is, our poverty, instead of preventing, will be the first cause of the increase of a standing army. Our poverty will render the people less able to pay the few troops it is admitted we must keep. This expense, added to the immense public and private debts, which an efficient government seems to be requisite to enforce payment of, together with the onerous and complicated civil governments, both continental and state, will be productive of future uneasiness and discontent. The most sanguine among us must expect some turbulence and commotion. Let the smallest appearance of commotion peep out again in any part of the continent, and there's not a rich man in the United States who will think himself or his property safe until both are surrounded by standing troops. What this citizen of Maryland is suggesting is that the principal function of a standing army is to protect the property of the wealthy. A standing army becomes the agent of the wealthy. This is the only public purpose for which these men ever did or ever will willingly contribute their money. But then, according to their laudable custom, they must have interest for their advances. This increases the public burdens. Commotion is followed by commotion. until the spirit of the people is broken and sunk by the halter, the scaffold, and a regular army of mercenaries. In other words, the idea here is that a standing army is a sure bet to become the agent of the wealthy and the powerful as a mechanism to circumvent the rights and liberties of the people. That's the reason that they oppose it. And then the citizen of Maryland says, "My countrymen, never forget this truth, which the sad experience of your fellow mortals has witnessed with their blood. Remember it yourselves. Engrave it on the tender minds of your children as the first article of their political creed, that there is no government safe with a standing army, and there is none that is not safe without it. A people may frequently be so unfortunate as to lose their liberties. They may be so foolish as to give them away, as in Denmark, where not only the senators and representatives of the people, but also every man in the whole empire of the smallest state of consequence signed a formal surrender of their liberties on an instrument now kept in the archives of that kingdom. An everlasting monument of how catching a thing this signing of names is, or of what is now called a modest deference for the opinion of others. But whether they lose them or give them away, they will soon regain them or resume them, unless they are prevented by a standing army." There is absolutely no question that the purpose of a standing army is to protect the property of the rich. There's also no question that the poor at some time will rise up against the power and the wealth of the rich. And the reality is that that's when a standing army comes into play. That's the end of the document. I think that this is an incredibly meaningful document for a number of reasons. It makes very clear the context for the Second Amendment, despite the interpretation of the Supreme Court headed up by Chief Justice John Roberts. I think there's absolutely no question that if you go back to the founders, the whole idea of the Second Amendment was based on service in the militia, because only a strong militia at the state level was seen as a meaningful way to protect citizens and their rights against the dangers of a standing army. Everybody during this period believed that. So every effort today to try to suggest that the founders believed that the right to bear arms was a natural, unalienable right to be included among the rights that Jefferson referred to in the Declaration of Independence, how else can I say it, is absolutely not valid. That interpretation is a lie. It is a fabrication. And the quicker we begin to address it and to understand it, the better. We are at 59 minutes after the hour. We've just reached the top of our first hour. So we kind of this and that at our way through the whole first hour, did we not? Again, it is a pleasure to be with you. I'm thoroughly enjoying it. I hope you are. I hope you're finding some of this information beneficial, perhaps a little bit entertaining. I hope so. I don't think it's dull. I hope you don't either. We're going to pause and take a break for 5 minutes, and then we'll return with our second hour. And in our second hour, I want to really shift gears and begin to address an issue which I think is so relevant in today's world, and that is the issue that Jeremy Surrey refers to as nation building. right after World War II, it was called economic development. We'll be right back. Please stay with us. Thank you.
We now return to the Virtual Center for the Study of the Constitution and Civic Responsibility on the Horn. Here's Dr. Bill.
Thank you, Bob Kincaid, and welcome back to our second hour on this, the 17th day of June. It is a Tuesday, and it is a pleasure to be with you here at the Virtual Center. We have a phone number that I want to make you aware of. We would love to hear from you. Our phone number is area code 304-574-8178. That's 304-574-8178. If you'd like to communicate directly with me on any of these issues, by all means feel free to do that. My email address is waobrien906@gmail.com. That's waobrien906@gmail.com. Again, let me remind you, as I did at the beginning of our first hour, that beginning tomorrow, our program time, delivery time, will change. Here in the East, we'll be beginning our program at 1 p.m., and we'll be running from 1 to 3 on the same 3 days of the week, Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday, and we'll be on regularly at 1 p.m. in the afternoon. There will be occasional changes. For example, on Tuesdays, I have a Rotary meeting here that meets at noon and doesn't get out until 1. So I think on Tuesdays we may have to go from 2 to 4 or something like that. But we'll have to make that decision as we go. But right now, at least for the next week, we'll be operating on the idea that our programs each day will run from 1 to 3 p.m. And of course, for those that pick them up on archive, it really won't matter. But for those who listen in real time, I think this is a very, very significant issue. And again, I'm kind of hoping that maybe at 1 o'clock here in the East, we'll begin to get some additional listeners who are in the middle of their day at 3 o'clock in the afternoon or 4 o'clock in the afternoon and are unable to listen. So maybe we'll get some additional folks, and maybe we'll get some people who will call and share their opinions and their perspectives with us. Again, the phone number is area code 304-574-8178. I mentioned that there was an issue that I really wanted to get into. It's related to foreign policy, and while some people may say, at least initially, well, this may be, if you really stretch, this may be related to the Constitution, but it's indeed a stretch. I would suggest to you that this is not true. And I have thought long and hard about this. And the issue of nation building, the way that this nation conducts its foreign policy, is directly related to the nature of the political system that we have in place, that the founders gave us. We have talked in the past about the book by Jeremy Surrey, who's a historian, an up-and-coming historian at the University of Texas in Austin, and his book entitled Liberty's Surest Guardian. Liberty's Surest Guardian. And his statement in his introduction that nation building as a concept is in America's DNA. And his idea, his thesis is that from the very beginning, nation building in its broadest sense has been really what American foreign policy has always been about, from conception to implementation. And we have, I think I'm going out on a limb here somewhat, but I think I would be accurate in saying that most people, when they hear the term nation building, are not that offended by it. Some conservatives are, because what we call nation building today draws people's attention to Vietnam and Afghanistan and Iraq. And many people see those as examples of nation building as being abject failures. But the fact of the matter is, as Jeremy Surrey points out, there have been very positive examples of nation building in our past. One of the examples that Surrey uses, I think, as an example, is the Philippines. And of course, the effort to develop the Philippines was a real problem at the very beginning. But I think, and again, this is kind of a chapter of American history that doesn't receive too much attention. But I think people overlook the very valuable service that William Howard Taft gave us as the first governor of the Philippines in the early 20th century. And of course, Taft is going to be president of the United States. But he basically delivers yeoman service as governor in the Philippines. And he is able to oversee and undertake a program of building infrastructure, roads, schools, churches, improving health, improving nutrition, and many other things that in Surrey's mind kind of become a model for what America's nation-building efforts are all about. Let me go back, and let me tell you first that one of the things that struck me, that raised my attention, is that while I was gone last week, I was in Massachusetts. And one day, last Sunday, I picked up the Boston Globe, the very well-known Boston newspaper, the Boston Globe. And on the back page of one of the sections is a full-color ad about a continuing education experience that's being made available in the Boston area, primarily through the efforts of the Boston Globe. And it's kind of a continuing education experience for adults. And what they have done is they have targeted 8 prominent professors from American universities who are specialists in certain areas, in certain disciplines. And they are bringing them to Boston next Saturday, this Saturday, the 21st. And the Saturday is divided into 2 morning sessions and 2 afternoon sessions. And during each of those 4 sessions, there will be 2 professors featured. And those who attend this university for the community will have a choice of one of the 2 presentations in each of the 4 time slots. In other words, for those who pay the tuition, I believe it's $149 for the day. Attendees are given the opportunity to pick 4 from the 8 presentations offered, 2 in the morning, 2 in the afternoon, and of course attendees are allowed to do lunch in Boston on their own. The reason I mention that is that one of the 8 presenters is Jeremy Surrey. And I was very, very taken with that. We had Jeremy in our PRISM West Virginia grant program, and he was astounding. His knowledge and insight into the pros and cons, ups and downs, successes and failures, benefits and losses, if you were, of American foreign policy is second to none. And his presentation is alive and it's infectious, and his knowledge is something that all of us, everybody that I talked to who saw this on Skype, agreed that this is something very, very special. Yesterday I emailed Jeremy at Texas and told him that if I was going to be in the Boston area this weekend, I'd sure be in attendance at these sessions. Anyway, the title of Jonathan Surrey's presentation this Saturday is going to be based on the successes and failures of nation building as American foreign policy. And that's what got me thinking about whether, in fact, here at the Virtual Center, we really needed to do something with foreign policy. We've done some in the past. We looked at the foreign policy of Roosevelt and others. But we haven't focused specifically on foreign policy strategy as indeed foreign policy. And then lo and behold, after I returned from New England this past weekend, in my mailbox was the latest edition of the New York Review of Books. And this is an aside. I'm not on retainer from the New York Review of Books. But I have to say, in today's ever-increasing world, where it costs more and more and more to remain informed, I think the one publication that I would be most reluctant to give up is the New York Review of Books. Those reviews are astounding. They are so substantive and so well written that the one thing I've noticed over the years is that once you read and reflect upon one of these reviews, you know whether you want to read the book or not. These reviews are not light, they are not fluffy, they are not wordy and lacking in substance. They are meaningful. They include a lot of substance from the book under being addressed at the time. And for the most part, they are critical reviews. And what I mean is, the authors of these reviews are not just writing marketing pieces for the authors of the book in question. They are reacting to the pros and cons, the positives and negatives of the books they are reviewing. Well, it just so happens in the latest edition of the New York Review of Books, and if you go online, nyreview.com, in the current edition, you will come across a review of a book entitled The Tyranny of Experts, Economists, Dictators, and the Forgotten Rights of the Poor by William Easterly. The title of the review is An American Passion for Tyrants, and the author of the review is David Rieff, R-I-E-F-F. This is about American foreign policy again. More specifically, it is about the economic development policies which America pursues after World War II, principally. But one of the things that Easterly does is point out that there's a historical continuity in American foreign policy that goes all the way back into the early 20th century. So actually, it's unfair to suggest that economic development only becomes American foreign policy at the end of World War II. And of course, I guess the best example of this would be the Marshall Plan, America's determination to rebuild Europe after World War II, and the reasons for it and the strategies employed to do it. For all practical purposes, that becomes the model of nation building which Easterly takes on. But again, his title is The Tyranny of Experts, Economists, Dictators, and the Forgotten Rights of the Poor. you may, from the title, suspect that what Easterly is doing is criticizing very adamantly an American foreign policy based upon the idea of economic development, principally because it ignores the interests of the poor in the nations and areas of the world being developed. And instead, it assumes an overriding dependency on experts, on economic planners, on economists, on geographers, on political scientists, on natural scientists, on environmentalists. In other words, Easterly's major concern is that economic development, as it's practiced in the United States, has for the most part relied most heavily on the expertise of the professionals involved, the planners, the economists, the political scientists, the geographers, etc. And the reliance on these professionals is accompanied by a tendency to pretty much overlook the interests of the population being developed. The people in these areas are not involved. They are not consulted. They are not included. Rather, they are treated as intellectual non-entities who have nothing to offer to this process. In order to implement the process, we need to rely on the experts. And so consequently, it seems to me what we are faced with here at the Virtual Center are two issues. One is this process of the strategy itself, how it works and why it works that way. And then the second issue, it seems to me, is to come to terms with Easterly's criticism of this process. So what I'd like to do, begin today, because we obviously it's almost 25 minutes after the hour. We have a little bit better than a half an hour to go in today's program. So we won't be able to get that far into it. But I wanted to begin at least by introducing the concept of economic development as it was put together by the person who's probably most well known as the architect of America's economic development policy. And that person is Walt Rostow. Some of you may remember that Walt Rostow was an advisor and a planner in the Kennedy administration. I would suggest, and where Walt Rostow's reputation has the most meaning for me, is that Rostow was instrumental in John F. Kennedy's Alliance for Progress policies in Latin America. Rostow was the architect. He was the one that put it all together. He was the one that developed the model. He was the one that laid out the strategy and the ingredients of a successful policy. Increasingly, Rostow's strategy was termed at the time in the 50s and 60s as modernization. If you go on the internet and you Google modernization, you won't have to go very far before you come across the name of Walt Rostow. Because not only was he the theorist that put these strategies together, but he was also the power behind the throne, as it were, in the Kennedy administration that laid out in chapter and verse the strategy for Latin America, which became the Alliance for Progress. Basically, what we are talking about when we talk about modernization is implementing the process in the non-developed world of economic development. In other words, turning traditional societies into modern societies. Initiating the process. Implementing the mechanisms. Unleashing the forces designed to produce the kind of change in the traditional world that, if followed through, is going to make these peoples, these nations, modern. Basically, what we are talking about here, I believe, is the economic rationalization for colonialism. As we all know, in the 17th and 18th century, colonialism was, for all practical purposes, economic exploitation. Major nations, Western nations, once they became capitalist in their internal structure, began to colonize areas of the world in pursuit of sources of raw materials for an emerging industrial world. And the other side of that is potential consumer markets for industrial products manufactured in these mother countries, in these nations, modern nations. But as we know, colonialism as a word, as a term, became very unpopular. It was considered to be inhuman because it smacked of exploitation. Nations seeking out underdeveloped areas of the world in order to rip off their raw materials, their natural resources. Because these nations were in search of timber and ore and oil and coal and all the rest of it for their own economic purposes. And so by definition, the colonies and the colonists who lived in them were considered second-class citizens. Well, by the time you get into the 19th century, the mid and late 19th century, colonialism as a concept becomes very unpopular. It's hard to defend. And the way you rationalize it is to put the kind of spin on it which emphasizes the benefits to the receiving cultures rather than the delivering cultures. By downplaying the benefits of economic development for the major nations and stressing the benefits to be realized within traditional societies that will be modernized, that will be, quote, civilized, unquote, that will be brought up to speed, that will be brought into a more modern world where people will have the same access to the products and rights and ways of life that we do. In the book review that I was referring to from the New York Review of Books, by William Easterly. He makes the point in criticizing American foreign policy. I'm not sure I can lay my hands on this right now. Here it is. He makes the statement, Easterly makes the statement, of course, believing that America's present is the world's future is an old American conceit. I love that sentence. Think about it. Of course, believing that America's present is the world's future is an old American conceit. There's no question that the assumptions which make up this conceit are, in effect, what has driven American foreign policy from the very beginning. We talked about William Appleman Williams's Tragedy of American Diplomacy some time ago. Williams, from the left, was very critical of American foreign policy because his position is it was pure, unadulterated exploitation. And what made it a tragedy was that we had within our power the opportunity to eliminate poverty in the world, to really uplift peoples of the world into a much more creditable and enjoyable standard of living. We had all of that opportunity, and we squandered it because of our assumptions that we had the right to tell people what to do and how to live their lives. We didn't have to ask them because the mere fact that they were undeveloped meant that they weren't capable of contributing to this process. All they were expected to do is be on the receiving end of what it was that we had to deliver, which was Western civilization. Rudyard Kipling, and you remember Rudyard Kipling's White Man's Burden, a very famous poem, written in relation to British policy in India. Rudyard Kipling wrote The White Man's Burden. Well, in the late 19th century, Kipling wrote an essay entitled The Long Spoon. And basically the implication of that was that what was happening in foreign policy, in the West's relationship with the non-developed world, was that under the guise of economic development, traditional societies were being destroyed. And for their own benefit, Kipling says, they really better look at the spoon, at what's in the spoon. But I love the line, believing that America's present is the world's future is an old American conceit. That, I would suggest to you, is the basis for William Appleman Williams' labeling of American foreign policy as a tragedy. But back to Walt Rostow. I mentioned that he was the advisor to Kennedy, who was the architect of the Alliance for Progress program in Latin America. And as a scholar, as a theorist, Rostow set out what he called his stages of growth, which becomes a model for modernization. And basically, it was interesting, his name is Walt Whitman Rostow. And this theory is laid out in 1960. And he says basically that economic growth, and all of this is theory, economic growth occurs, he says, in 5 basic stages. Stages which can and usually do vary in length. They aren't all the same length. They don't happen lockstep. The 5 stages are, first, traditional society. It becomes important to understand the nature of traditional society, what it is, what it's about, what it's not, and specifically to focus on the assumptions and attitude of the people that live in these traditional societies. What do they expect? What do they take for granted? What do they value? What do they look forward to? What are they afraid of? Etc. That's the element, the essence of what Rostow calls the traditional society. Then the second stage is what he calls the preconditions for takeoff. In other words, what has to happen? What do you have to have in place before change begins to occur? Before the kind of changes happen that turn a traditional society into a more modern one. So what Rostow is doing here is identifying what he calls the conditions for takeoff. And then his third stage is the takeoff, the economic development itself. The policies and procedures and laws and enactments and investments that comprise modernization, that comprise economic development. And once economic development begins to happen, which is the third stage, then you move into the fourth stage, which Rostow calls the drive to maturity. In other words, once a nation begins to modernize, what has to happen in order that these changes become permanent? What kinds of changes does the society have to undergo so that you can actually term a particular society no longer traditional, but now modern? And then finally, the last stage is what Rostow calls the age of high mass consumption. A society which is based on the principles of mass production and mass consumption. This is the society that we know so well as the consumer society. We've heard terms in recent years like the me generation, the now generation. The fact that people are no longer willing to postpone pleasure to the future. They want it all now. Today is the first day of the rest of your life. Grab it now, because tomorrow may never come. And all of these other cliches and phrases that help us define a society where people's principal role in society is as consumer. We know today that the strength of our economy, we're getting numbers and measures all the time. What is the unemployment rate? Did it go up? Did it go down? How many jobs were created last month? How many additional people filed for unemployment? And these kinds of numbers, these kinds of data that come to us every month so that we can measure the success and the speed of economic development, what we are increasingly talking about is the American consumer population. To what extent is the American population consuming? To what extent do consumers have faith in the economy? And of course, I would suggest, and I'm kind of getting ahead of myself here because this is something we're going to be doing tomorrow, But I would suggest that one of Easterly's major criticisms of the economic development model, of the modernization model, is that it tends to reduce people into entities called consumers. It kind of implies that we cease to be human and we become automatons. We become people who buy and sell, people who consume. And that's really all we are. And there's no question that you get a note of hostility and anger in Easterly's book over that. Well, it's really interesting because once Rostow lays out these stages of economic growth, his model for modernization, which again, traditional society, preconditions for takeoff, drive to maturity, and the age of high mass consumption. I would ask you to think and reflect for a moment, because here at the Virtual Center, one of the things I want to avoid is presenting information for information's sake. If it doesn't have any meaning, it's not worth having, is my motto. So I frequently will pause in an effort to try to bring meaning to this, to bring substance to this, and to suggest, what does all of this mean? And I would ask you to consider the following. What Rostow's stages of economic growth, his modernization model, really amounts to is an effort to recreate the history of the development of Western capitalism from its very beginnings through the Industrial Revolution and into the modern age. Rostow's model for modernization is his effort to lay out a model and say, this is what you must do in order to cause those people living in that traditional society to transition into a modern one. In effect, what Rostow is giving us is a compressed version of the history of the West. He's basically suggesting that the only way to create economic development in the non-developed world is to initiate the kind of changes which force those societies to go through the kind of changes that the West went through in order to reach the quality of life that the West has received today. Example. The last stage of Rostow's model is the age of mass consumption, making everybody consumers. Part of that is to convince people to become consumers, to convince people to want things. And in many cases, you're doing it with people whose whole way of looking at the world is based on the idea that once my needs are met, I'm satisfied. I don't need any more. I'm not looking to go anywhere. In other words, one of the characteristics of a traditional society is that people are not future-oriented. They are present-oriented. They are actually past-oriented. Traditional societies function on the basis of what always worked. What we do is what we've always done, and the way we do it is the way we've always done it. By definition, traditional societies are very suspicious of change. They don't look upon change as a good thing. They look upon change as a very dangerous thing. And what that implies is that the people who live in a traditional society, I'm getting a little bit animated here, I'm banging my own microphone. The people who live in a traditional society really don't look toward the future. They're not looking toward progress. The word progress doesn't even exist in a traditional society. Security and peace and stability and happiness does. I would suggest to you that the focus on the future, the focus on progress, man's idea of profit, man's idea of becoming better and better and better as time goes on, all of that is related to the transition into modernism. It's clearly tied up directly with the ingredients of Western capitalism. Capitalism couldn't function unless people, first and foremost, were consumers. In order for them to become consumers, they must want to become consumers, which means they must want things. They must value things more than principles, more than values, more than morals, more than anything. Money becomes the way you measure the value of things. Therefore, money fits very, very well into this model, into this transition model from traditional society into a more modern one. So the more you get into Rostow, the more you begin to realize that what his stages of economic growth are really about is laying out and dividing into pieces a compressed history of Western development. And what he's basically suggesting to America, to the United States, is that our government policy must be to recreate ourselves over again and over again and over again in those areas of the world which continue to be traditional. If we have to sell refrigerators because we've gone through the Industrial Revolution and we have a lot of people who work in plants, who work in industry manufacturing refrigerators, then the only way their standard of living can be enhanced and improved is when more and more people want refrigerators. That means that our priority must be to convince people who don't even know what a refrigerator is that they want them. Not only that, but they want modern ones. They want self-defrosting ones. They want color-coded ones. They want stainless steel refrigerators. Brief break, coughing spell there. So in a sense, that becomes critical to Rostow's model. Well, it seems to me a way to really appreciate Rostow's model, we'll go back tomorrow and kind of review some of this because we've only got 10 minutes left to go in today's program. But what I wanted to do is marry or connect Rostow's model to another model of economic development, which is, for lack of a better term, usually referred to as the backwardness model. And it was created by Alexander Gerschenkron, 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 Alexander Gerschenkron. And it's called the backwardness model. And basically what this model suggests is that the more backward an economy is at the outset of economic development, the more likely certain things are to occur. In other words, the further a society has to come in order to get out of its traditional mode and become more modern, the more predictable it is, the more specific things you must do. Let me be specific. The backwardness model is based on the following premise. The more backward the economy you're beginning with, the more likely intervention by special institutions will be necessary to properly channel physical capital and human capital toward industry. Now this makes perfect sense. The more backward the economy, the more likely intervention by special institutions will be necessary. What that means is, the more backward the society, the less luxury you have in waiting for these changes, these modernization changes, to occur on their own. The more necessary it becomes to help them along, to push them. So consequently, the more backward the society, the more direct implementation, the more visibility of planners and economists and experts who come in and consciously tell people, this is what you need to do. This is what you must do. The second characteristic about the backwardness economy, the backwardness model, is the more backward an economy, the greater will be the emphasis on the production of producer goods more than consumer goods. And this makes perfect sense. You can't have consumer goods until you have production. So if there's no production, then the first issue you have to address is production goods, not consumer goods. That comes later. Let me revisit, if I can, Alexander Hamilton's model for American development during the Washington administration, his so-called economic plan. And without going into details on it here, Hamilton believed that American independence itself was in jeopardy so long as Americans depended upon British manufactured goods. You'll remember that when the 13 colonies were colonies, England didn't allow them to manufacture. England required them to extract their raw materials, their natural resources, and send them to England for processing. So what Hamilton is pointing out during the very first administration under the Constitution, the Washington administration, is that the American economic machine is deficient in manufacturing. Therefore, in order to modernize and in order to preserve and protect and grow our independence, we have to put our resources first and foremost into production. We have to find ways to stimulate industry. We have to find ways to protect industry with things like high tariffs. We have to find ways to buy the loyalty of investors and manufacturers toward the new government. So Hamilton proposes an economic program where government will literally, through the payment of interest, will issue securities and buy the loyalty of the people it needs in order to implement or to get off the ground this economic development model. So consequently, the more backward the economy, the greater the emphasis on the production of producer goods rather than consumer goods. Also, the more backward the economy, the greater the effort on capital-intensive production rather than labor-intensive production. Think about that. The more backward the economy, the more attention you have to pay to capital-intensive production, investment, profit for investors, rewarding risk. Government's number one priority needs to be to minimize risk and to reward it in order to encourage the investments. The labor-intensive production will come later, once everything's in place, once the industries are humming, once the capital is there, once the investment is there, once the factories are there, then the labor-intensive production will come later. It makes perfect sense. The next element is the more backward the economy, the greater the scale of production and enterprise. In other words, it stands to reason. The further you have to come, the more focused and concentrated must be your effort. The more backward the economy, the greater the reliance on borrowed rather than indigenous technologies. And this makes perfect sense. If you're beginning from the beginning, you don't have any existing technologies to borrow from. You have to import all of it. So the Washington administration, with Hamilton's leadership, goes out of its way to encourage patents and investors, to encourage corporations, to protect corporations with things like limited liability laws. In other words, all of government's policies are designed to produce what we call modern economic development. And what Gershenkin is pointing out is the further you need to come, the more visible and more certain are the stages you need. Finally, the more backward the economy, the smaller the role of agriculture as a market for new industries. Obviously, industrialism is going to expand agricultural production, but there's going to be fewer people working in it. So the more backward the society, the smaller the role of agricultural sector, because you already have agriculture. That's what a traditional society is. It's the industrial investment sector that you need to promote. And finally, the more backward the economy, the greater reliance on productivity growth. So there, in conjunction with 5 stages of Rostow's model for modernization, there we have the model of economic development. This is the package that the Kennedy administration decides to bring to Latin America. This is the package that the Truman administration uses to rebuild Europe after World War II in the Marshall Plan. All of it is in the context or against the backdrop of communism. The assumption is made from the very beginning that poverty means the area is ripe for communism. Therefore, we must make it a priority of our foreign policy to eliminate poverty in order to thwart the expansion of communism. Thus, the Alliance for Progress in Latin America. Thus, the Marshall Plan. Thus, a number of other economic plans. Now, we know all of this as the process of nation building. And I ask you, we're within a minute and a half of the top of the hour, consider nation building in Afghanistan. Consider what's happening in Iraq right now. Consider why. Consider what the failures of the modernization model seem to be. Think about the role of government in all of this. I think we've got more than enough to chew on in preparation for our program tomorrow. It's 59 minutes after the hour. This is Bill O'Brien. You've been listening to the Virtual Center for the Study of the U.S. Constitution and Civic Responsibility. This is what we've been dealing with, part of the promotion of the public welfare, the public interest. This is what governments do. Thank you for listening. Be safe. Please be back with us tomorrow. Remember, 1 p.m. in the East, 3 hours earlier than today. Be safe, and thank you so very much. Good evening.